A little girl in Oklahoma once asked her mother a simple question. Why had the sky turned black in the middle of the afternoon? Her mother didn't answer. The truth was too painful to say out loud. The wind wasn't carrying rain. It was carrying the family's entire farm, dust by dust, into the horizon. This is not a story about numbers on a stock exchange. This is the story of what happens when an entire nation's confidence collapses at once, and how ordinary people rebuilt their lives from nothing. Welcome back. Today, we're exploring the Great Depression. Not through Wall Street, but through the eyes of the people who actually lived it. Let's rewind the clock, not to the crash itself, but to a decision made years earlier that most people don't even talk about. In the early 1920s, the United States government made a strange choice. Instead of regulating the booming stock market, it did almost nothing. Buying stocks was treated the same as buying a loaf of bread. Simple, casual, and something everyone could do. Shoe shine boys were giving stock tips. Taxi drivers were investing their tips. There's a famous story about Joseph Kennedy, father of future President John F. Kennedy. He sold all his stocks after his shoe shine boy started offering him investment advice. His logic was simple. If even the shoe shine boy thinks he's an expert, the market has officially lost its mind. That one decision saved his family fortune. Millions of others weren't so lucky. Now here's something most people never learn in school. The Great Depression wasn't just an American event. It was a chain reaction quietly building since World War I ended. European countries owed massive war debts to the United States. Germany was crushed under the Treaty of Versailles. It struggled to pay reparations to Britain and France. So here's the strange cycle that was happening. America lent money to Germany. Germany used it to pay Britain and France. Those countries used it to pay back their war debts to America. It was a financial merry-go-round, and everyone assumed it would spin forever. When American banks stopped lending freely after 1929, this entire international chain snapped. Germany's economy, already fragile, collapsed even harder than America's. And a broken, desperate Germany is exactly the environment where extremist ideas find fertile ground. We'll come back to that thread later, because it matters more than most people realize. But first, let's talk about something almost nobody mentions. The sound of the Great Depression, literally. Before 1929, American homes were filled with music, laughter from radio comedy shows, the excited chatter of families planning weekend outings. After the crash, visitors to American towns described an eerie silence, not because people had nothing to say, but because shame had gone quiet through entire communities. Losing your job wasn't just a financial blow back then. It was treated as a personal moral failure. Men who had been proud factory workers, engineers, and business owners suddenly felt worthless. Historians have documented a disturbing trend during this period. A noticeable rise in men leaving their families. Not out of cruelty, but out of unbearable shame at being unable to provide. Some walked out the door one morning saying they were going to look for work, and simply never came back. This is the part of the Great Depression that doesn't show up in economic charts, but it shaped an entire generation's psychology. People who grew up during this era became famously frugal for the rest of their lives. They saved wrapping paper, they reused tea bags. They never fully trusted banks again, even decades later. Now, let's talk about a game that quite literally came out of this economic disaster. In the early 1930s, an unemployed man named Charles Darrow began designing a board game in his basement. It featured fake money and properties you could buy, and the thrill of building wealth, something painfully absent from real life at the time. He called it Monopoly. Parker Brothers initially rejected it. They claimed it had 52 design flaws, but Darrow kept pushing. By 1935, Monopoly became one of the best-selling games in American history. Think about that for a moment. In the middle of the worst economic collapse in modern history, Americans were buying a game where the entire point was pretending to get rich. It wasn't just entertainment. It was psychological escape. People wanted, even for just an hour on a Sunday evening, to feel like they had control over money again. Now let's shift to something equally overlooked: Hollywood. While banks were failing and farms were turning to dust, movie theaters across America were somehow packed. This might sound strange, but it makes perfect sense once you think about it. For the price of a single ticket, people could escape their reality for 2 hours. This period gave birth to what historians now call the golden age of Hollywood. Studios produced glamorous musicals and lighthearted comedies, larger-than-life adventures, specifically designed to help people forget their empty wallets, even briefly. The film industry didn't just survive the Great Depression. In many ways, it thrived because of it. This tells us something powerful about human psychology during economic collapse. When people lose control over their financial reality, they desperately seek control, comfort, or escape somewhere else. Now, let's go back to that thread about Germany. because this is where the story turns genuinely dark. As Germany's economy crumbled under the weight of the global depression, unemployment there eventually crossed 6 million people, desperate, humiliated, and searching for someone to blame. Many Germans turned toward radical political movements promising quick, simple answers. A struggling former soldier and painter named Adolf Hitler capitalized entirely on this economic desperation. His rise to power wasn't built purely on ideology, it was built on empty stomachs and broken pride. This is perhaps the most important lesson buried inside the Great Depression. Economic collapse doesn't just destroy bank accounts, it creates the exact conditions where extremism, fear, and blame can take root and grow. Within a decade, the world would be at war, and many historians directly trace a line from the Depression's devastation to the outbreak of World War II. Back in America, one man tried something radical to fight back against the despair. President Franklin D. Roosevelt didn't just create economic policies, he changed how government communicated with its citizens entirely. Through his famous fireside chats broadcast on the radio, he spoke directly and calmly to millions of frightened Americans, sitting in their living rooms. He explained banking reforms in simple language. He reassured people that their money was safer than they believed. This might sound like a small detail, but consider this. An economic crisis is also a crisis of trust. Roosevelt understood that rebuilding confidence mattered just as much as rebuilding the economy itself. His New Deal programs put unemployed Americans to work, building roads, bridges, dams, and national parks that many of us still use today. The Hoover Dam, ironically named after the president often blamed for the Depression, became a symbol of this era of massive public works. But perhaps the most quietly revolutionary change was something most people take for granted today: deposit insurance. Before this reform, if your bank failed, your money simply vanished with it. Afterward, the government guaranteed that ordinary people's savings would be protected, even if their bank collapsed. This single policy fundamentally rebuilt trust in the American financial system. Now, here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. Could something like the Great Depression happen again in today's world? In many ways, modern economies have built safeguards specifically because of what happened in the 1930s. Deposit insurance, financial regulations, and central bank intervention tools all trace their roots directly back to lessons learned during this era. When the 2008 financial crisis hit, and again during the 2020 pandemic economic shock, governments around the world acted quickly, with stimulus and intervention, largely because policymakers remembered what happens when you don't. The Great Depression essentially became humanity's painful economics textbook, written in real suffering rather than theory. But safeguards don't mean immunity. Economic bubbles still form, speculation still happens. Human psychology hasn't changed, even if our financial systems have grown more sophisticated. People still chase quick returns. People still convince themselves that this time is different, right up until the moment it isn't. So what can we personally take away from a disaster that happened almost a century ago? Perhaps it's this: resilience isn't just about surviving hardship. It's about what you build in response to it. The Depression gave the world monopoly, born from a man's basement dream of escaping poverty. It gave the world modern deposit insurance, born from millions of families losing everything overnight. It gave the world entire government safety nets, born from witnessing what happens when there's absolutely nothing to catch you when you fall. Sometimes the darkest chapters in history end up rewriting the rules for everyone who comes after. That little girl in Oklahoma, watching dust swallow her family's land, eventually grew up in a very different America, one with unemployment insurance, protected bank deposits, and Social Security. Her hardship, and the hardship of millions like her, quite literally rebuilt the foundation of how modern economies protect their citizens. And maybe that's the real lesson of the Great Depression. Not just how badly things fell apart, but how deliberately humanity chose to make sure it would never fall apart quite the same way again. If this story gave you a new perspective on an event you thought you already understood, let us know in the comments below. And if you want more deep dives into the human side of history's biggest moments, make sure you're subscribed for what's coming next.